everybody, this is Fun Police, and we are back with another Fire and Maneuver Nation Guide. For today, we are taking a look at the Ottoman Empire, a quantity-based nation that is one of the most interesting in the entire game. We've previously looked at nations like the Shogunate and Russia, which are very melee-centric spam nations, having lots of shock and melee drill in order to win their fights with. The Ottomans, on the other hand, are a bit different in that regard. The biggest things relating to them is that they do retain some amount of melee perks, such as shock, but the more defining aspect of the Ottoman army overall is that a lot of their units have breakable, which is a trait that has the issue where units that lose their cohesion end up taking damage at the end of a turn. And this overall makes it so the Ottoman army is generally swarming people with numbers, but yet doesn't want to get into melee with most of its army, creating a very interesting and unique swarming style faction. Now, to offset this, the Ottomans do have probably the single largest army of any faction in the game. With so much breakable and other negative perks, these units have their prices drop through the floor, and you are pretty much always going to outnumber anybody that is not a similar spammy nation. If you enjoyed today's content, make sure to also like and subscribe, and if you're interested, check out the other guides that have already been done. We have covered nearly half of the Fire and Maneuver roster, and we'll be covering the remaining nations in the coming times. But otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into the early period, and we'll talk about the Ottoman Empire in that age. The Ottomans in the early period are in an interesting position as, unlike a lot of other quantity nations such as Russia, they actually do get access to a higher limit of rifles, sitting with 4 of them. This overall allows them to play a bit more of a ranged game, and although they're not on par with some of the higher quality nations like Britain or France, this still is a notable advantage for them. Talking about the units themselves, we start off with the Radif Infantry, a militia unit with disorganized and breakable. These guys are extremely cheap, one of the cheapest units in the entire game. They absolutely suck in combat and don't hold their own in any fight. Pretty much any other unit is going to be able to bulldoze over them. However, their cheapness means you can bring a lot of them, and you can use these guys as throwaway units, whether that's just flanking the enemy, getting them into throwaway charges, or a variety of other things. There's not a lot the Radif infantry can't be used for, and their loss is minimal if anything. It is very easy to bring like multiple of them and barely spend any of your actual money, allowing you to invest in higher quality units that can fill out the rest of your roster. Moving on, we have the Bashi Bazouk. The Bashis are another militia unit, but they have shock instead of breakable. Bashis are probably one of the more foundational units for any Ottoman build. Shock is a very powerful trait, and in a quantity-based nation, it's always good to have some shock lying around. You often have a lot of units that are creeping towards the enemy, and you generally can try to envelop them, and the Bashis are a payoff for that. Their low cost relative to other units means that they can slam into a melee, deal a lot of damage, and generally be quite effective in that role. There's not a whole lot that the Bashis can't do, although they don't do well at ranged combat, so keep that in mind. They're pretty much for melee only. Then we have the Turkish line infantry. A vanilla line infantry, yet they have the breakable perk, making them much cheaper, but also very uncomfortable if the fighting gets up and in their face. They much prefer to sit at range or sit in a place where they're not going to get focused fired down. Open order is a major friend for them, and if you keep them at a distance, say with a rifle or something, They essentially act like a basic line infantry, but just cheaper, and that can be very useful. The Egyptian line infantry is sort of the mirror opposite of the Turkish, where the Turkish doesn't want to get close. The Egyptians are much more comfortable when they get close. Disorganized is a trait that is generally offset if you're next to or in a melee with an enemy unit, and as such, the Egyptians are much more comfortable of getting up close and personal. They also have the rugged perk, which actually means that the Egyptians are very good at wrapping around the enemy and pulling off flanks, being able to do things like quickly cross rivers or sneak through forests to get behind the enemy. They don't hold up as well in ranged combat due to disorganized, but they can still be very useful and are a powerful combination with the Bashi Bazook. Then we have rifles. This is your range drilled infantry and are the only range drill infantry available in the early period. Their stats are quite low, but the combination of range drill and skirmishing gives them quite a bit of punch compared to any other options, and they are quite unique in that they are still relatively cheap. They only cost a few more points than that of the basic Turkish line infantry, which means it is far easier for the rifles to be incorporated into builds. These are the other units that are generally part of the foundation of many Ottoman builds, being able to give you that ranged firepower for very cheap, allowing you to support your other units like Bashis before they go in, and even can allow you to fight decently at range as long as you don't let your breakable trigger by losing all of your cohesion. Moving on to the cavalry, we have mounted rifles. They are essentially just a regular rifle, but on horseback. There's not a whole lot to say about them, but mounted rifles are a little bit worse than your basic rifled unit. The biggest thing is that although they have much higher movement speed, they only get carbines, meaning that they are limited in their range. However, that can still be useful as it is additional cheap range drill to incorporate into a build. You also have the Bashi Bazook Cavalry. The Bashi Bazook Cavalry is essentially just a Bashi unit, but on horseback. It's overall a solid overall cavalry containing shock, which is always good on light cavalry. They are relatively durable with high enough health and only disorganized. They can hold their own in melee, and the shock gives them a lot of damage up front. They're overall very useful and probably the go-to shock option for cavalry in the Ottoman Empire. You also have Lancers. Lancers are your power unit in terms of sort of being a kamikaze. They have both disorganized and breakable, and are essentially just a cheaper version of the Bashis. However, they are far less durable due to that breakable. They take a lot of damage, and it's pretty common that a Lancer will go in, take a bunch of damage, and then generally doesn't get a chance to get out before it dies. So Lancers can be very, very vulnerable, but their low cost makes them sort of a throwaway unit. They're one of the cheapest options in terms of getting shock for the Ottomans, and that can give them a use. We also have the Cossacks. The Cossacks are a rugged shock cavalry, having similar stats to the Bashi Bazook, but losing 2 health and gaining rugged. They're another very solid unit, and similar to something like the Egyptian line infantry, they're very good at wrapping around the enemy and flanking them due to that rugged, and the shock makes them a must-demand threat. If the enemy ignores them, they're going to get charged in the side or rear, and the Cossacks are generally going to take a very favorable trade. In terms of heavy cavalry, you have the Dragoons, a heavy cavalry with breakable and efficiency, and then 6 health and 4 cohesion. They're very similar to the Turkish line infantry, being a unit that doesn't like to get up close and personal with the enemy. However, they do have a big benefit of having efficiency, and in fact, they are the only efficient unit available to the Ottoman Empire. As such, if you're looking for responsiveness and quick moving units, Dragoons are actually a high value priority and can definitely work their way into quite a bit of compositions. You absolutely do need to run carbines on them, as otherwise they have to get into melee to be effective, and breakable highly discourages melee. Do be careful with them, as they don't last long in terms of taking shots. Most notably, the breakable and lack of skirmishing means that if you put them in a bad position, they can very easily die. But if utilized well, they can be a very useful response tool to a variety of enemy movements. Then you have the cuirassiers. The cuirassiers are sort of your heavy melee unit. With melee drill, disorganized, and 5 cohesion and 6 health, cuirassiers are very, very good. They're the only melee drill available in the early period, and they pair very well with stuff like your Bashis, either being the unit to initially go in while taking minimal damage, or being a follow-up to another unit charging in and just adding a ton of damage and health into such a melee. They're overall very, very beneficial, and their high price tag is the only thing that could be argued against them. But with how cheap the rest of your army is, it's generally not a problem to work a cuirassier into a build. In terms of artillery, you start off with the 8-pound field artillery. With both disorganized and breakable and cumbersome, this artillery is not going to last long if it takes any damage, and also is generally unresponsive due to cumbersome. However, the one thing that this artillery piece has going for it, it is cheap. It is cheaper than that of a Turkish line infantry with rifles, and generally, it is just one of the cheapest artillery pieces you can get. This is very, very useful in that instance, because it is so easy to work one of these 8-pounds into a build. And although they might not be the most effective, they are still adding some amount of suppression and can offer good coverage with dispersed battery, the formation, to generally just make it a cost-effective artillery piece. Even losing it is not that big of a deal. You then have the 11-pound field artillery piece, which is essentially just an 8-pound but with +1 range. You are paying quite a bit more for it, which is par for the course due to the bonus range, and it does act a lot more like an actual artillery piece. You do have to actually start protecting them now, because you are paying a bit of a premium for it compared to your other units, but the extra range is very, very useful. You also have a 4-pound horse artillery, 3 range, so they are similar to the 8-pounds. They are more expensive, but they do have 2 speed. This makes them much faster, being able to either get out of a bad situation quickly, or being able to get into position to set up and shoot at stuff in a more rapid fashion. This generally makes them quite effective, and they can be a very solid unit to support your other units. Combined with stuff like range drill or just your other rifle troops, they can be very, very effective. And the final thing is the 25-pound howitzer. With indirect fire and 4 range, these guys are slow to set up and are quite expensive, being one of the most expensive units available to the Ottomans. But 4 range and indirect fire is very good at just being flexible. You're able to swarm an enemy, and these can safely sit behind your massive hordes of units and blast away regardless of what's in front of them. There's no issue of blocking sightline with these, and that can make them very useful. Put them in behind something like a forest, or behind a hill, or just, again, behind your other units, and they can provide great fire support. When it comes to building the Ottomans, the simple fact that your army is going to be so massive leads to just a vast amount of options in terms of your building. And in fact, I would say that the Ottomans often depend and kind of require you to adapt to whoever you are facing. As an example, here is maybe a more generic build, one mostly focused on simply having a bit of everything in order to fill a variety of roles that you might be looking for. A build like this has tons of shock, backing it up with a good amount of ranged firepower, and in general is just a flexible build. However, depending on who you're facing, it is often good to keep in mind, you may need to lean in other directions. One example could be if we are facing something like, say, the Russian Empire, who is much better at getting into melee than us due to stuff like the Crestiane or their heavier infantry. And as such, we may want to lean a little bit more into that sort of melee aspect that allows us, or get away from the melee aspect, and instead compensate with some better ranged firepower. Something like a 25-pound howitzer and a dragoon gives us a little more flexibility against them and allows us to blast them down before they get into our melee zone too aggressively. If you wanted to do a build that is maybe more focused around range in order to counter something like a nation like Russia, then something similar to, say, this could be done. This build has pretty much min-maxed the amount of ranged firepower you have. All your rifled units, you have a powerful artillery piece, you have additional range drill and efficiency. You have a little bit of shock in there because it's always good to have shock, like never go without shock. But then you also have some rediff infantry to kind of throw away and bulk out your numbers against something like, say, a Russian build. But in the end, you're actually just able to kind of play with a bit of everything. The main things I would recommend is always try to keep some amount of rifles and bashis in your build. Those two are pretty much your primary units. You can play without them, but if you're looking to be effective with the Ottomans, range drilled with some rifles or some cheap shock is just a good combination. And then you can kind of build around that however you need. But now let's go jump over to the late period where we get some new units and the Ottomans get a pretty good step up in terms of their capabilities. The late period is a different story for the Ottomans, and the biggest single change to the Ottoman army is that it is a lot better at fighting at range now. It has gotten several additional options that constitute more range drill, and most notably, its arsenal has been expanded. Rifles are commonplace. It has access to breech loaders for the units that want them, and it even has access to rifled breech loaders, giving them a lot more punch. This is overall pretty dramatic in terms of their changes, and the Ottomans get to play a lot more of a range spam nation now. But talking about the new units first, we start off with the Zouaves. They are essentially a basic line infantry with melee drill and disorganized. They are quite nice. The higher cohesion and melee drill gives them a lot more utility and staying power than that of something like the Bashis. They may not be as cheap or throw away, but they're also able to more or less hold their own in a fight much better. If you're looking for something to an infantry that can not only fight at range, but also take a bit of fighting up close and personal, Zouaves can be very useful. Then you also have the Imperial Guard, a very interesting heavy infantry, the only ones for the Ottomans. 6 health, 5 cohesion, range drill, and breakable. This unit is arguably very, very powerful if you keep it at a distance. It's essentially a super version of the Turkish line infantry. But the extra cohesion means that its breakable will trigger less, and notably, range drill gives it a lot of power. It can hit very, very hard, especially with something like a rifled breech loader, which are commonplace in the late period for something like this unit. Overall, very, very powerful, and probably one of the biggest additions to the Ottoman army in the late period. And then we get 2 new artillery pieces. The first one are Gatling guns. The Gatling gun is a low range but high firepower unit. It does not notably have cumbersome, meaning that it's a bit more responsive than many of the other artillery the Ottoman have. It still does have breakable and disorganized, meaning that it actually does die very, very quickly. However, breech loading allows it to shoot twice, and anti-personnel means that if an enemy is next to the Gatling gun, God help them because they will probably die. Gatling guns will deal so much damage, it's not even funny with anti-personnel. Now, you won't often be able to pull that off, but even just having a unit that can suppress multiple enemies and chip in damage, especially for the low-ish cost, can be useful. Make sure to use the concentrated battery formation to give it 3 range, so it doesn't have to be so close to the enemy. Then you also have the 4-pound Krupp artillery, and a very interesting artillery piece. The 4-pound Krupp gun is retaining cumbersome, but has range drill and breech loading on it, alongside 3 range. They are quite expensive, the same as something as the 25-pound howitzer. However, they hit very, very hard. They deal a lot of damage, and they're great with suppression and all your other range drilled units. And these are another unit that can really help the Ottomans punch above their weight at range. In terms of builds, the Ottoman Empire generally will start to lean a bit more into its range drilled spammage in the late period. Melee builds are still very powerful, but it's very difficult to get away from how much range drill this faction actually has. And that means you have a lot of wiggle room in terms of how you want to do it. Here's an example of a build utilizing 2 Imperial Guards, 2 rifles, and a Krupp gun for plenty of range drilled, backed up by some Egyptians and then a lot of different Bashi units in order to get into melee if they need to. A build like this puts a lot of emphasis on the guards, rifles, and Krupp dealing the damage, but you also still do have a decent contingent of melee. You could also forego that and go pretty much all in on the ranged aspect, utilizing essentially just all ranged units alongside a few Bashi in order to carry it. But a build like this would be better against something like Russia, who still wants to get into melee, while against a quality nation, you probably would want to go with something like the previous build. Imperial Guards in general are very, very powerful, and I would always consider at least bringing one of them in your builds. They're very durable, they're cost effective, and they hit very, very hard. You can also work in stuff like the Zouaves instead of Egyptian line infantry if you have the funds. They're not as flexible in terms of mobility, but they are able to act as also melee units, which is quite useful. But regardless, that is the late period for the Ottomans. And with that, we are at the end of this guide. A quick overview of the very interesting Ottoman Empire. It's definitely one of the most unique quantity nations in the game, and probably one of the most unique just outright. With so many negative perks, its army is going to die faster than anybody else's, but you don't care because individual units mean very little to the Ottomans. Unlike other nations like, say, Britain, where losing 1 or 2 units can often be like a quarter of your army, the Ottoman forces can lose 4 militia units and barely blink an eye at those losses. Combine that with cheap options for both range drill and melee, and the Ottomans are able to kind of adapt and have a bit of everything in their toolbox. They are powerful, but they are also difficult to play. It is definitely a balancing act between managing your breakable units and your melee disorganized ones. It is also a challenge to adapt to the enemy and also just maximizing the effectiveness of your army. But one of the quickest things that the Ottomans can lose to is if they aren't aggressive enough. That is at least one thing you should always keep in mind. You need to be the one holding the initiative in fights. If you are being passive, you will more than likely lose. But with that said, we are at the end of this video. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Again, make sure to like and subscribe, and check out the other guides that I have made. We have gone through over half of the nations now, and the other half will be coming in the near future, so you don't want to miss out on those. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.